Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi paid official visits to Eritrea, Kenya and the Comoros. The visit to African countries at the start of the year is a tradition that dates back to 1991. Last year, Wang visited Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Tanzania, Botswana and the Seychelles. We discuss the ties between African countries and China now. We're joined by Dr David Monyae, Director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Monyae, thank you very much for joining us. What should we understand of Africa-China relations, especially when it comes to what has been termed the debt burden?
The debt burden, it comes at a time when the United States and China have embarked on trade wars, and at the geopolitical level, I think the tension between the two countries, it's getting worse, and this means competition in all fields. And therefore, I think China has played a critical role on the African continent in infrastructure development. But with COVID-19 and all other challenges that the African continent confronts, there has been some challenges that some countries do not have sufficient resources to continue with their infrastructure development projects, and therefore the Western world is coming with a number of issues, including this new term of debt trap. But there hasn't been much studies to really measure and come to such conclusion. If you look at the actual debt, I think Africa owes the Western world more money than China.
It's that debt and this debt. So whether it's the United States, whether it's China, whether it's Turkey, whoever is vying for a position on the continent, can we truly afford it?
It really depends. The problem is that people will use a sweeping statement, the African continent. We are 55 countries, 1.2 billion people, and you can't compare South Africa with Djibouti or Comoros with Tanzania. These countries do vary in terms of their ability to absorb debt, to borrow and to repay. And you always have the poorest countries on our African continent, those in the medium, and then bigger countries that are able to negotiate and handle their debt well. So I think we really need to make arguments and pinpoint the specific countries we are talking about before we clear speaking of Africa as if it's a country.
I appreciate that point, and I do take it. So let's take a look at Kenya and how China has plugged in, especially when it comes to infrastructure. So you take a look at the railway from Kenya's port to Mombasa, that being some $5 billion that has been bandied about for that construction. Eritrea is also a poor country. So when we talk about affordability, maybe let's use those two examples. Can they afford this debt?
I think Kenya is way ahead. In the short term, there might be problems. And let's face Kenya in particular. I've been privileged to be in those countries and have seen these projects. Kenya, for instance, the Mombasa, Nairobi, and attempts to take this rail to Uganda border, it's in the long term going to bring more development in Kenya, opening areas of Kenya where they had huge problems, lots of debts in terms of traffic on the ground, goods not moving on time. In the short term, I think there has been issues raised concerning the manner in which this particular rail was dealt with. And if you look deeper in those issues, those concern land, purchase of land, allegations of corruption in some of these issues, and the nature and character of this contract in itself, like all other contracts, wasn't really in the open, in a sense that some politicians, particularly the opposition in Kenya, started raising some of these issues. But I haven't come across anyone who will question the viability of the Mombasa-Nairobi rail. It is changing the landscape of Kenya. In the long run, like all other major infrastructure in the world, it takes time for them to get paid, as well as to measure that we need to measure to what extent does this rail impact ordinary people who wants to move their tomatoes on time to the urban areas and really benefit and change the lives of people on the ground. So on the whole, we'll say the rail in Nairobi, Kenya, Mombasa, will benefit Kenya greatly. Djibouti, it's a total different story. It's a smaller country. In the same arguments can be made, but all depends with key questions that we're grappling with. To what extent are Africans negotiating these debts? How do they understand their own capacity to not just negotiate, also to be able to repair this infrastructure? But infrastructure on the African continent is critical. We have no any other way to go other than to build this infrastructure.
And that's exactly the point, right? Like, we have no other way to go than to build this infrastructure. You take a look at countries that gained independence way back in the 70s, and you take a look at the state of infrastructure, it's found wanting. And you can't help but ask the question, is it China's intervention that we need, or is it a will that we need from our leaders, right? And I ask you that specifically in relation to the African Continental Free Trade Area Act. China has the Silk Road and Belt initiative. So how are we then going to, work when we have this debt that we not owe only to China, but to the United States, to the likes of Turkey, and yet we have this ambitious program of AFTA that is supposed to lead the way?
A number of issues that will arise. We need infrastructure. We need to work on that. We need to have skills. We need to plan properly as we enter into agreements. And we also need to avoid getting bogged down in other people's wars. The West and China are competing, and it is not in our interest to take sides, whether it be in favor of the United States or in favor of China. All what we need and the kind of question that we need to do, what interest, how are we going to gain out of this competition? So I think in the long run, we have to have scholars that are serious about these issues, assist our own governments. A starting point is just to stop corruption, which is a major issue. We need to scrutinize ourselves, where I agree with you fully, in terms of the kind of leaders we have, the kind of employees that are managing this infrastructure on the African continent. At the end of the day, we really need to trade among ourselves as Africans and ask questions as the one that you've asked. What is it that we're going to benefit out of One Belt, One Road initiative? How much of Africa's products are entering a booming Chinese market? If we are able to measure that based on the infrastructure that we're developing, and therefore I think we'll have less problem.
Reports were abound of China repossessing pieces of land or an airport, it was alleged, in Uganda because they could not service their debt. Are you aware of that?
Yes, we are quite aware. Most of these cases, one avoids getting into them because you really don't know what is the truth, whether it's just a propaganda from the West or it's true. We just don't know. There's no information on the ground. There's a lot of story about Sri Lanka. I think it has been 5 years now. Whenever China is raised, they always talk about the Sri Lanka port. And we have had case of Zambia, that Zambian Broadcasting Corporation will be taken by China And there was another case of Entebbe Airport in Uganda. It's going to be taken by Chinese. If you look at the situation and understanding China foreign policy fully in light of the visit by Foreign Minister, it is not in Chinese interest to take this major key point in these countries. It will undermine the credibility of China. And therefore, it just leaves us hearing stories that are emanating from the West, particularly on these issues, and without real information on the ground.
Dr. Monyae, perhaps a final question to you. Why would a corruption-intolerant country like China do business with what is seen to be a corruption-riddled Okay, I do take your point earlier of not talking about Africa as a country, but why would it do business with some countries on the continent that are seen to promote corruption?
It really depends. Like all countries that are entering into trade with us, the question of corruption will come at the end. Let's come closer home. The Lesotho Dam, I think World Bank came up with issues of corruption that came when it was constructed, and huge issues that were involved. In our own country, the Zondo Commission came up, and some of the major companies, global companies, were involved in corruption here. So it doesn't really matter whether it's Chinese or Western countries. The really key issue is to what extent we as Africans tolerate corruption. Why do we allow our leaders to enter into deals without really following key procurement procedures and really scrutinize and have no zero tolerance on issues of corruption? As it stands in most African countries, people get away with cases of corruption. And therefore, I don't think we should be pointing fingers at outsiders, whether they be Chinese or Americans. We need to look at governance issues, ensure that we create a regulatory framework that is conducive for major infrastructure development and the development of our own countries and our people.
Especially if we are to make the African Continental Free Trade Area Act work. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That was the director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg, Dr. David Monyae.